Hi, I wanted to shoot this video to share 10 journeys of successful candidates I work with this year to help you to understand more or less what it takes and the type of people who pass these interviews, what type of experience they have, and what are some keys to understand what works and what doesn't if you want to be successful with such endeavors, right? So the first scenario would be when candidates had been working for a FANG company and they wanted to transition into another one, right? It doesn't always work, but in my experience, this has been where I had the most successful conversions, so to speak. Not the most people I coach, but the most successful conversions, right? And here I had two scenarios to share with. First scenario would be with someone who got laid off from a FANG and who pursued another role with another FANG. And the way they did it was not by specifically pursuing only one role with another FANG, but rather to interview for other opportunities as well with non-FANG companies, which they landed. They had offers from non-FANG roles and said, then if we can also get this FANG opportunity, we can get this offer in a FANG, that would be ideal. And it turned out, they were successful in this endeavor, right? What I would like to highlight here, this candidate did not take a 1 year off because they could. I'm speaking about an over $500,000 a year job. They had plenty of referrals, plenty of people to refer them into these roles. The screening rounds were only formalities, okay? And they did prepare a story bank. They prepared like everyone else, even though these roles were director level roles, okay? The second scenario of someone transitioning from a FANG into another was a lot more straightforward because actually an older client of mine whom I helped land a job in a FANG 5 years ago, and they contacted me this year that they wanted to pursue a transition into another FANG. They were still employed, they weren't impacted by the layoffs, so it was a low risk approach for them. They were not desperate by any means to get into the new role. Interviewing was their strength. They had a story bank, even though they had a story bank from 5 years ago or 6 years ago when they first built it, when they first landed the job with the FANG. And all these pieces put together contributed for them to be successful in their role, right? Again, so these two roles I think were both paying well over $500,000 a year. And there's over 1 million such jobs in the US, in case you didn't know, right? So it's not such a rarity, right? Now, I haven't only had successful journeys with people who had FANG in their CVs. For some reason, I'm having a hard time understanding why I cannot help people working for Amazon transition into other FANG roles. I'm yet to understand these things, right? And maybe one more note here, these roles were rarely publicly posted. In fact, the two successful stories I'm talking about, I always received PDF files. They were never posted outside. Okay, so you understand what I'm saying here. Now, the second scenario, the most common of them, and where most people I work with are when you don't have a FANG in your CV, but you want to land a job with a FANG company, right? And here I can share with you, let's say, 5 such scenarios. The first scenario of an international candidate who landed the job in their second attempt to apply for that role. What I would like to highlight here is that the candidate, even though they prepared they took the interview seriously, they also have plenty of referrals, plenty of people to refer them to the role, right? So the screening rounds were again a formality. And the second thing that is super important to understand is that they could reapply for that role 1 month later or 3 weeks later, anyway, pretty quickly for that specific role. And it wasn't as if that role was specifically crafted for them, right? So again, even though they were an international candidate, they didn't have a FANG in their CV, they did have so to speak, a good enough brand to be worth interviewing twice. And it was the second time that I got to know them as well, and the second time they were successful. Okay, or another, the second scenario of someone going for a job from a non-FANG into a FANG was when they were they were already working with that FANG company, but from a supplier perspective. So they were a supplier for that specific company. And it was in a marketing role. And in this marketing role, so he knew pretty much everyone whom he was going to interview with. So he knew the hiring team. And because of the fact they were such a preferential candidate, they even knew the questions in advance for their job interview. Okay, so needless to say, their screening rounds were formality, practically non-existent. They also, everyone I'm talking about here, prepared story banks without a single exception, right? Not everyone shared their story banks in full, but most people did. And when they didn't because it wasn't practical, because our focus was only on role play. They didn't ask me to analyze anything about them, right? But the second scenario would be when they were already working with that FANG, so they wanted to transition, so to speak, there in the other side of things, right? The third scenario of someone landing who did not have, again, an international an international candidate who landed the job in Europe, in Berlin. This time, this candidate had absolutely no referrals whatsoever. He had to pass, for real, all the screening rounds. Then he got a weird hiring manager, so to speak, who initially planned their final interviews. Then they canceled those final interviews. Then the hiring manager got fired or left the company, and then they had another hiring manager assigned. And long story short, they had their final interviews rescheduled like 2 months before the screening rounds. Now, what I would like to highlight here is that the candidate used these 2 months to actually prepare that interview for real. And they ultimately were successful in their preparation. But the main thing here is that I know that not many of you would spend 2 months to prepare job interviews. And again, this candidate was passing the interviews for real. like he had no referrals, he had no insider knowledge, he was not a preferential candidate. So it was, but he took 2 months to prepare the interview, right? Another example of a candidate, this time a senior accountant, a CPA, who previously worked as a small business owner and who wanted, she was already working in a corporate space, but she wanted to transition into a FANG. And what I found particularly interesting about this case is the determination. Okay, so it wasn't as if that candidate was desperately looking to find a job. They were already in their existing role. They weren't impacted about layoffs. But she was, I think, between the very few candidates from whom I hear, then let's do 2 hours instead of 1 hour because I want to cover more ground. When in fact, most candidates say, okay, but I wouldn't really role play. It's too early, I'm afraid, so on. No, she was really determined to pass that interview, and she was actually very successful in her endeavor. Okay, another scenario of an Australian, I think it was a software architect or something like this, who again passed an interview with AWS. It's not a secret, and what determined the determined factor, the most important factor in their successful journey, he was a customer of my training programs primarily, was that for a period of 3 months, every other day, so to speak, at least every other day, they would log in and revise their stories. They would ask feedback from AI, they would do whatever, but they revised that story bank for 3 months. And I'm not exaggerating, 3 months. I think it was over 3 months if I counted day by day, and probably they logged in more than once every 2 days. Okay, so again, someone who prepared for a period of 3 months just in order to pass a job interview. You could tell, the interviewing wasn't their strength. They weren't an expert with these things, as it often happens with candidates who have FANGs in their CVs, but they really wanted to succeed in their endeavor, and if it took 3 months for them to prepare, yes, that's what it took. I don't know if they had any referrals and stuff like that, but again, they were successful, right? Now, the third scenario I wanted to share with you, which I found particularly interesting, is for people who looked to get into a FANG company and ultimately landed in a non-FANG business, but they were super happy about their choice. Okay, it happened with someone who worked for 20 years at a well-known FANG as a senior technical program manager, and they actually wanted to transition initially into another FANG, but they were unsuccessful. I mean, they passed those interviews, but they couldn't find the team internally. Happened at Google, by the way. And they ultimately landed a job with a famous US, very successful US bank. And they wrote me because they were super happy with their choice ultimately. I mean, they were surprised by the type of work they had to do at that bank. They never thought it would get that interesting, right? Another classic scenario would be when someone who is not sufficiently skilled to get into a FANG role, right? I've had an accountant who worked in various places who tried to land a job with the FANG company. He tried for 1 year, I think, 6 months or something like that, and he ultimately, lowered a little bit their standards and works for a very successful smaller business as an accountant. And they understood, especially when I presented them the parallel with the senior accountant, with the CPA, what it took for that lady to pass the job. He understood, he wasn't there yet, so he chose an intermediate step to land the job there, right? And I've also had people who prefer to leave the US because of the current situation to some lesser known companies, and apparently this scenario also is something that works pretty well for them, right? So it's possible that you're not working for a FANG, you want to land in a FANG, but if you're unsuccessful landing a job there, you say that, hey, the economy in the US is not one such that I'm happy with, so I would rather go abroad. It happens. Okay, so I thought I'd share this as well with you, right? So as some closing remark here, everyone I'm talking about here none of these people were desperately looking for a job. Okay, I want you to understand it right from the start. For most people, they were already having good paying jobs. Another good chunk of these people could have other jobs with non-FANG companies immediately if they wanted to. And this is how it works. You don't desperately look for jobs there. Yes, if you feel like you must put pressure on yourself to perform, yes, but that's another thing, right? Stress resistance. Like, I've only presented you successful scenarios here, but I won't present you the number of people who abandon preparing their job interviews or preparing to advance in their careers because of various events, in their lives. But many times I could feel the candidates could not resist the pressure, right? I'm not speaking about role play necessarily. That's a very basic example I use for demonstration, but you could feel when someone, and I've developed unintentionally this skill of reading people for stress, right? So if you're not strong in your head, then, reconsider things. The third note I'd like to share with you is that many of these many of these candidates also were quite secretive. Many of these people had referrals, had the right people in the right spots to advance through those screening stages, not to pass final interview rounds. It won't work this way. But if you want to get a good start with these things and to pass screening rounds, you need to know someone in those companies. And oftentimes those roles are not publicly posted. Okay, so I think it's the first time that I hear for so many roles not being publicly posted and getting filled, right? Yes, fewer opportunities than in previous years. I believe it's clear for everyone, but I was surprised about the conversion ratio. Like, I have far fewer customers, but they convert extremely well. Like, I won't give you numbers, I don't want to advertise, and I don't think those numbers make any sense anyway, but conversions are something I've never seen this before. And probably, because we're transitioning back to the normal state of things, where the market becomes more balanced, so to speak. Well, now it's a bit tough, I agree, but it's more balanced than the previous years when you could land jobs in FANGs accidentally and you would feel like, wow, I'm that good. Okay. All of these people that I'm talking about had story banks. Like I cannot stress enough how important it is to have a story bank. If you don't have a story bank going into these job interviews, I hope you call interviewing your strength. I hope you're a genius with interviews, because it does happen for some of these people to call them genius of interviewing. But in my experience, every one of them without exception had story banks. So that would be a starting point if you want to get good with these things. Because what happens if when you start preparing a story bank, you realize also, hey, are you there yet? Are you skilled enough for the role that you're applying for? Maybe you're not there yet. Maybe you need an intermediate step, right? Or maybe you realize, hey, I'm stressed out. Hey, maybe I don't want to go there right now. But the story bank would be the starting point here. And again, where most people fail, or where most people realize that, hey, you know, this is the number one test I should take, right? So I hope you found my insight useful, and thank you very much for watching.